The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in the QA department wasn't just a sound, it was the ambient soundtrack to Will's life. For 7 years, he'd been the quiet guardian of quality, the unseen architect who ensured the company's products didn't implode on launch day. His kingdom was spreadsheets, bug reports, and the satisfying click of a well-tested feature. Will wasn't the flashiest employee, not by a long shot. He didn't schmooze at company picnics or strategize during expensive off-site retreats. His currency was accuracy, his superpower was diligence, and his office chair, a monument to countless hours spent meticulously dissecting code and processes. He was the guy you called when something broke, the guy who knew why it broke, and crucially, the guy who could fix it before anyone even noticed it was wobbling. He was the unseen engine, the unsung hero of a corporate machine that often ran on more ego than efficiency. And then, there was Chris. Chris wasn't an engine, he was a rogue combustion chamber, sputtering and spewing noxious fumes into the otherwise functional workspace. Chris was the kind of manager who believed locker room talk was a company-wide perk, not a hostile work environment. His jokes, delivered with a leer that could curdle milk, were less about humor and more about asserting dominance, particularly over anyone he deemed less than him. And in Chris's narrow, warped worldview, that meant anyone who wasn't a white, able-bodied male who laughed a little too loudly at his thinly veiled, sexist barbs. He'd make comments about women's appearances in front of everyone, dismiss valid concerns with a wave of his hand as emotional outbursts, and generally create an atmosphere so thick with disdain and disrespect, you could practically chew it. It wasn't just the female employees who suffered. Even the male employees who weren't part of Chris's inner circle of sycophants were treated with a bewildering lack of basic human decency. Deadlines were met with public dressing downs, feedback was delivered like a personal insult, and any suggestion for improvement was met with a condescending sigh and the phrase, "Are you questioning my leadership?" Will, in his quiet, QA-focused way, had always tried to navigate the storm. He'd focus on his work, keep his head down, and hope that eventually the tide of Chris's toxicity would recede. He'd witnessed colleagues, mostly women but not exclusively, visibly deflate after interactions with Chris. He'd seen promising careers stall, good people leave, their passion eroded by the relentless drip, drip, drip of his abuse. He'd heard the whispers in the break room, the hushed complaints that started with a sigh and ended with a resigned shrug. But Will, bless his meticulous heart, believed in process. He believed that organizations had systems to address such issues. He believed in HR. Oh, how naive he was. The breaking point wasn't a single dramatic incident. It was the slow accumulation of indignities, the casual dehumanization that had become the norm. It was witnessing a junior developer, Sarah, reduced to tears after Chris publicly ridiculed her meticulously prepared presentation, calling her ideas girly nonsense and demanding she find a man to handle the real work. Will, his gut churning with a righteous anger he rarely indulged, finally decided enough was enough. He couldn't unsee Sarah's broken spirit. He couldn't ignore the growing rot. He painstakingly documented everything he could, the date, the time, the specifics of Chris's offensive remarks, the reactions of his colleagues, the palpable shift in morale. He compiled his observations, formatting them with the same sterile precision he applied to a software bug report. Then he did the unthinkable. He went to HR. He sat across from Brenda, a woman whose smile was as plastic as the buttons on her headset, and Mark, who looked like he'd been born wearing a beige cardigan and a perpetual frown. Will laid out his case, calmly, factually, presenting his documented evidence. He spoke of the toxic environment, the demeaning language, the impact on productivity and morale. He wasn't asking for Chris's head on a pike. He was asking for the environment to be addressed, for the abuse to stop. Brenda nodded, her plastic smile never faltering. "Oh, Chris," she said, a dismissive little titter escaping her lips. "Yes, that's just his personality, dear. He's very passionate. You just have to learn to work with it." Mark chimed in, his voice a droning monotone. "It's a high-pressure environment, Will. We all have to adapt. We can't accommodate everyone's sensitivities. It's just how he is." "Sensitivities?" Will repeated, the word feeling like a foreign object in his mouth. "This isn't about sensitivities. This is about harassment. It's about creating a hostile work environment. People are being hurt." Brenda patted his hand, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like a gentle shove towards the exit. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention, Will. But honestly, it's just his personality. You'll get used to it. Everyone else has." "Everyone else has gotten used to it?" Will's voice rose, a tremor of disbelief running through it. "So, the solution is for everyone to just tolerate abuse? To just get used to it?" Mark shifted in his seat, his frown deepening. "We've considered your feedback, Will. However, based on our observations and Chris's performance reviews, we believe your perspective might be disruptive to team cohesion. We're implementing some organizational changes, and unfortunately, your role is no longer a fit. We'll need you to clear out your desk by the end of the day." The words hit Will like a physical blow. Disruptive. Him. The man who spent his life preventing disruption, who built systems to avoid chaos. He was being fired for reporting the very disruption that was tearing the company apart. The irony was so thick, so sickeningly sweet, he almost choked on it. They escorted him to his desk, a sterile, impersonal process that felt more like a jailer escorting a prisoner than an employer terminating an employee. As he packed his personal belongings into a cardboard box, a worn coffee mug, a framed photo of his dog, a well-loved paperback, he saw Sarah watching him from her cubicle, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and recognition. She knew. They all knew. He walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the weight of the cardboard box, a metaphor for the heavier burden he now carried. He wasn't defeated, not entirely. There was a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in his stomach. They thought they had silenced him, that they had neatly tied up a loose end. They thought disruptive was a synonym for problematic. They had no idea that they had just unleashed the most meticulously organized, process-driven, and utterly infuriated QA manager they had ever encountered. They had just made a fatal error. As Will drove home, the city lights blurring past his windshield, his mind wasn't replaying the injustice or the humiliation. It was already building a new framework, a new system. He thought about Sarah, about the others, about the hollow platitudes of HR, and he remembered a tiny, almost insignificant detail from his onboarding. A clause in his employment contract, buried deep in the legalese, that he'd meticulously reviewed out of sheer habit. A clause that allowed for the retention of personal documentation and intellectual property created on personal time, even if tangentially related to company work. He'd always kept his personal notes separate, his own little sandbox for ideas and observations. But what if that sandbox could become a vault? He parked his car in his driveway, the familiar squeak of the garage door opening a welcome, grounding sound. He carried the box inside, not to the trash, but to a secure, climate-controlled storage unit he rented on a whim years ago, a place for things he deemed too important to risk in his own home. He placed the box inside, a small smile touching his lips. They wanted him gone? Fine. They wanted him to be disruptive. He could do that. He could be the most disruptive force they had ever seen, and he wouldn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to build the right system. That evening, Will sat at his desk, not the one from the office, but his own. A sturdy oak piece that had seen him through years of personal projects and coding endeavors. He opened his laptop, the familiar glow of the screen, a comforting presence. He bypassed his personal email, the one he used for online shopping and newsletters, and navigated to a brand new, encrypted email account he'd set up years ago for a hypothetical ethical hacking project that never quite materialized. This account, however, was about to be very real. He typed out a brief, carefully worded message. Subject: a voice for the voiceless. Body: to my colleagues at Company Name, I understand many of you have experienced or witnessed difficult situations at work, particularly concerning management practices. I am creating a secure, anonymous platform to share your experiences. If you have stories, documentation, or evidence of inappropriate behavior, I urge you to share it here. Everything will be handled with the utmost discretion and anonymity. Your voice matters. He added a disclaimer about not sharing anything illegal, but encouraged the sharing of screenshots, emails, recordings, anything that illustrated the reality of their workplace. He sent the email, not to individual addresses, but to a carefully curated list of external, non-company email addresses he'd quietly gathered over his tenure, including some he'd found on LinkedIn from former employees who had left under less than ideal circumstances. He wasn't sending it into the void. He was launching a carefully calibrated probe. Then he opened another file. This one wasn't for sharing. This was for him. He started a new document, titled it Operation Due Process. He created folders within folders. Chris's harassment log, HR negligence, employee testimonials, digital evidence cache. He began to meticulously transfer every bit of his own documented evidence, the notes he'd taken during his brief, futile meeting with Brenda and Mark, the screenshots of inappropriate messages he'd subtly captured on his company phone before his access was revoked. He knew his phone was probably wiped, but he had made his own local backups. He even logged the exact date and time he'd been escorted out, noting the presence of Sarah and her silent acknowledgement. He wasn't sad. He wasn't angry in a way that would cloud his judgment. He was focused. He was methodical. He was the QA manager, and his new project was to perform a full system audit on the rot that had been allowed to fester. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a well-tested algorithm, that the flaws he was about to expose were deeply embedded in the core code of the company itself. The silence that now filled his home was not one of defeat, but of anticipation. Chris and his enablers had just signed their own termination notices, and Will, the quiet, unassuming QA manager, was holding the pen. Part 1 was over. The setup was complete. The counterplay was about to begin. The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in the QA department was a distant memory, replaced by the quiet thrum of Will's personal server, a testament to his meticulous nature. Fired for being disruptive, he was now about to unleash a disruption of catastrophic proportions. The cardboard box he'd carried out of his old office contained not just personal belongings, but the seeds of his meticulously planned counteroffensive. His Operation Due Process was no longer hypothetical. It was a living, breathing digital organism, meticulously fed and cultivated in the secure, climate-controlled unit that had once seemed like an eccentric indulgence. Will worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon. He digitized every shred of evidence he possessed. Emails from Chris, filled with their venomous subtext, were carefully scanned and tagged. His own notes, detailing dates, times, and the exact nature of the harassment, were cross-referenced with witness accounts that began to trickle in. That anonymous email, launched into the digital ether, had been a precisely calibrated probe. It hadn't just reached former employees, it had also found those still trapped within the suffocating embrace of Chris's management, those too afraid to speak but desperate for an ally. He created an encrypted, decentralized platform, a digital fortress where employees could upload their grievances, their screenshots of abusive texts, their audio recordings of demeaning tirades. It was a clandestine network built on the same principles of integrity and security that had once defined his work in quality assurance. He implemented a multi-factor authentication system for anyone wishing to contribute, ensuring anonymity and preventing unauthorized access. Each submission was met with a personalized, automated response. Thank you for sharing your experience. Your voice is vital. He never revealed himself, never responded directly, but he validated every single story. The sheer volume was staggering. Dozens, then hundreds, of messages flooded in, junior developers recounting public humiliations, female colleagues detailing Chris's inappropriate advances, even male employees who had simply been on the receiving end of his volatile temper. The narrative of a single disgruntled employee quickly dissolved, replaced by a damning tapestry of systemic abuse and HR's complicity. His own contract, a document he'd once reviewed out of habit, became a crucial weapon. He meticulously extracted clauses related to non-disclosure agreements, severance packages, and, most importantly, intellectual property ownership. He knew the company's aggressive expansion strategy relied heavily on proprietary software, a system he had, in large part, helped to build and perfect. He had always compartmentalized his work, keeping personal project documentation separate, a practice that now proved prescient. His personal codebase, filled with his unique contributions and innovations, was meticulously cataloged, each element tied back to his documented hours and design documents. The first tremor of the earthquake Will was orchestrating arrived subtly. A critical client, one who had been with the company since its inception, lodged a formal complaint. Their core integration software, a product Will had personally overseen for years, began exhibiting intermittent failures. Deadlines were suddenly missed. A highly anticipated product launch, one he had QA'd with his usual unwavering diligence, faltered on its initial release, plagued by bugs that should have been caught weeks prior. The internal panic was palpable, though the blame was initially misdirected. Whispers circulated about a new system instability, a temporary oversight. Then, a former colleague, a woman named Sarah, who had been visibly devastated by Chris's treatment, reached out. Her message was brief, sent through a secure channel Will had provided. Will, they're a mess. Project Phoenix is failing, Chris is blaming the dev team, HR is doing nothing. It's like you were the only one who knew what was going on. Sarah's words were a confirmation, a crucial piece of intel that validated the breadth of his efforts. He also began receiving panicked text messages from current employees, disguised as innocent check-ins. Hope you're well. Things are tense here. Deadlines missed. Chris is losing it. Brenda and Mark seem clueless. The rising panic within the company was becoming a symphony of their own making. Will remained a phantom. He monitored news feeds, industry forums, and company social media with an almost surgical detachment. He watched the narrative within the company shift from confusion to apprehension. Internal memos began to circulate, vague pronouncements about streamlining processes and optimizing team performance. These were the frantic attempts of a cornered animal, trying to patch holes in a sinking ship. The moment for the first, decisive move arrived when he saw an announcement for a major investor presentation. The company was boasting about its innovative new proprietary analytics suite, a suite built on the foundation of his work, now being presented as a revolutionary breakthrough by Chris's hand-picked team, a team that lacked his intimate knowledge and, crucially, his signed intellectual property rights. With a calm that belied the seismic force he was about to unleash, Will crafted a single, concise email. It wasn't addressed to Chris, or HR, or even the CEO. It was addressed to the company's primary investor, a venture capital firm whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary. He also CC'd the relevant regulatory body for financial compliance. The subject line was innocuous: Clarification on proprietary software ownership, Project Nightingale. The body of the email was brief and factual. To the esteemed partners of investor firm name and the regulatory body, it has come to my attention that the recently highlighted analytics suite, codenamed Project Nightingale, is being presented as a wholly new development. As the principal architect and sole author of the core codebase and underlying algorithms of this suite, I wish to formally clarify ownership. My employment agreement, specifically Clause 7b, states that upon termination without cause, all intellectual property developed or significantly contributed to by the employee, including proprietary code and design schematics, reverts to the employee. I was terminated without cause on date of will's termination. Attached is my original employment contract and supporting documentation of my authorship, including commit logs and original design blueprints. I trust this clarifies any potential misunderstandings regarding the provenance and ownership of this critical asset. Sincerely, Will Sterling. He attached the meticulously organized files, his contract, detailed commit logs spanning years, original design documents, even a few archived conversations with Chris that, while not explicitly abusive, demonstrated a clear lack of understanding of the technology Chris now claimed as his own. He didn't send it to the entire company or even to the executive team. He sent it to the one entity that would understand the gravity of IP theft and contract breaches with immediate, devastating clarity. He watched the timestamp on his sent folder. Then he closed his laptop. The silence in his home was not one of defeat, but of profound anticipation. He had laid the first domino. He had sprung the trap. The company, so busy congratulating themselves on their cleverness, was about to realize they had just been meticulously audited by the very person they had tried to erase. The counterplay had begun, and it was playing out with the cold, hard logic of a perfectly executed algorithm. The days following Will's targeted email were a silent, unnerving prelude. He monitored news outlets, industry blogs, and internal company leaks, watching for the ripples of his carefully placed stone. At first, there was nothing. The silence was almost more unnerving than a public outcry. Had his message been ignored? Had it been buried by internal politics? But Will knew the investor firm he'd contacted. They didn't ignore contractual obligations. They didn't overlook intellectual property disputes. Then, the dam broke. It didn't start with a roar, but with a frantic, desperate whisper that quickly escalated into a full-blown corporate crisis. A terse, official-looking inquiry landed in the inbox of the CEO, an email from the investor firm demanding an immediate clarification of IP ownership regarding Project Nightingale. This was followed swiftly by a formal notification from the regulatory body, initiating an immediate audit. The air within the company, once thick with self-congratulation, turned toxic with fear. Suddenly, Will's name, which had been so easily discarded, was being whispered with a mixture of terror and awe. He received a flurry of panicked messages from former colleagues. "Will, what did you do?" "They're freezing all funding." "Chris is freaking out." "HR is in lockdown." Sarah, his former junior developer, sent a frantic text. "The investors are here. The CEO looks like he's seen a ghost. They're asking about Nightingale, and Chris has no answers. Nobody does except you." The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a carefully orchestrated summons. An email landed in Will's personal inbox, bypassing all security protocols. It was from the CEO himself, a man Will had only ever seen in carefully curated company photos. The tone was a stark departure from the arrogance Will remembered. It was clipped, formal, and laced with a desperation that was almost palpable. "Dear Mr. Sterling," it read, "I am writing to you today regarding the recent inquiries concerning Project Nightingale. It has come to our attention that there may be some misunderstandings regarding its development and ownership. We would greatly appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter with you at your earliest convenience. We believe a mutually beneficial resolution can be achieved. Please indicate your availability for a meeting or a confidential call." Will stared at the screen. Mutually beneficial resolution, the corporate euphemism for a desperate plea. He drafted his response with the same precision he applied to debugging code. He didn't agree to a meeting. Instead, he proposed a single, face-to-face encounter at a neutral, public location, a bustling cafe, chosen for its anonymity and its abundance of witnesses, should the need arise. He specified the exact time and date. The meeting was a tableau of corporate desperation. The CEO, a man named David, arrived with the company's general counsel, a sharp-featured woman named Eleanor, whose posture radiated controlled anxiety. Will, dressed in his usual understated attire, arrived precisely on time, carrying nothing but a single, slim folder. He sat opposite them, a calm island in their sea of agitation. "Mr. Sterling," David began, his voice strained, "we appreciate you coming. This situation, it's become untenable. The investors are threatening to pull out entirely. The regulatory body is making demands we can't meet. We need to understand what's happened." Will opened his folder. It's quite simple, David. You fired me without cause, and in doing so, you mistakenly believed you were discarding an employee. Instead, you discarded the custodian of your most valuable asset. He slid a document across the table. It was his original employment contract, with Clause 7B highlighted. This clause states that upon termination without cause, all IP developed by me reverts to my ownership. Project Nightingale, the core analytics suite you're now showcasing, is entirely my creation. Every line of code, every algorithm, every design schematic, you have no legal claim to it. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp. That's a bold claim, Mr. Sterling. We have extensive documentation of team contributions. Team contributions, Will echoed, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Indeed, and I've compiled them. Every commit log, every design document, every architectural blueprint bears my name. Chris, your esteemed manager, has perhaps provided you with some creative interpretations. But the digital record, and indeed my contract, is unequivocal. He slid another document forward, a comprehensive report detailing the company's IP theft, cross-referenced with legal precedents. I've also included evidence of HR's complicity in ignoring widespread harassment, which, while not directly related to the IP dispute, paints a rather unflattering picture of your corporate governance. The regulatory body, I'm sure, will find it quite illuminating. David paled. Mr. Sterling, we are prepared to offer a generous severance, a significant financial package. We want to resolve this amicably. Amicably? Will's voice remained level. You dismantled my career for speaking truth to power. You silenced me and tried to erase my work. Amicably feels a bit late in the game, doesn't it? He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. I will, however, present you with two options. He slid a third document across the table. It was a single page, divided into two columns. Option A. Will continued, his gaze steady. You acknowledge the breach of contract. You formally reinstate my position as lead architect of Project Nightingale with a substantial increase in compensation and a public acknowledgement of my contributions. Furthermore, Chris and the HR personnel involved in my dismissal will be reassigned, perhaps to a remote data entry position with no client interaction. This option allows the company to salvage its reputation, retain its most critical asset, and avoid a public relations nightmare and a potentially devastating lawsuit. David and Eleanor exchanged a panicked glance. And option B, Eleanor managed, her voice tight. Will's gaze hardened. Option B is the nuclear option. You refuse to comply. I file a comprehensive lawsuit detailing not only the IP theft, but also the systemic harassment and HR's deliberate negligence. I will expose every single piece of evidence I have. The audio recordings, the damning emails, the testimonials from your employees. The resulting lawsuit, coupled with the regulatory investigation, will cripple this company. Your investors will flee, your stock will plummet, and the brand will be irrevocably tarnished. You will face fines, sanctions, and public humiliation. This is not a bluff. I have the evidence, the legal backing of a pro bono team who are eagerly awaiting this opportunity, and no need to protect a company that discarded me so callously. He let the silence stretch, the weight of his words pressing down on them. The cafe noise faded into a dull hum. David looked at Eleanor, his face a mask of despair. Eleanor, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. We need time to consider this, David stammered. You have 24 hours, Will said, calmly closing his folder. My terms are non-negotiable. I've already prepared the necessary filings. The choice is yours. He stood, a quiet dignity emanating from him. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in their distress. He simply acknowledged the inevitable. As he walked away, he heard Eleanor's hushed, urgent voice. David, we have to accept. We have no choice. The next morning, Will received a single, official email. Subject: Acceptance of Terms, Project Nightingale. It was from the CEO, David, confirming his return as lead architect, along with the specified compensation and HR's immediate restructuring. Chris, the architect of so much misery, was, as Will had predicted, reassigned to a back-office data processing role, far from any human interaction, his managerial reign ending in utter disgrace. Brenda and Mark from HR were also redeployed to roles with zero decision-making power. Will's return was met not with fanfare, but with a profound, almost reverent silence from his former colleagues. They understood. They had witnessed the quiet man they'd dismissed as disruptive dismantle a corrupt system with the precision of a master strategist. His office was no longer a sterile cubicle, but a spacious corner office overlooking the city. He had the authority, the resources, and the respect he had always deserved. He didn't harbor resentment, not anymore. He had found a different kind of peace, one born from justice and validation. He had proven that integrity, diligence, and a well-documented process could triumph over arrogance and abuse. If watching corporate hubris meet its well-deserved, meticulously planned downfall strikes a chord with you, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Because there's always another story of silent strength waiting to be told. For in the end, the quietest individuals often possess the most powerful tools for change. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply the truth, meticulously uncovered and unapologetically revealed.